We are not your grandmothers and grandfathers in NAACP, and I know some chapters that's what I think of. We wanted to make this organization that already existed, that had a name, to see if we could make it work more effectively for justice in our community.
Well, first of all, I need to say that I'm a great admirer of Dr. King. I probably see Dr. King a little differently than many people. Many people know Dr. King and Malcolm and Huey Newton and Garvey. They know them from slogans. But I've had the opportunity to get to know these guys through their works. I've watched countless hours of film. I've read all of his books. I think a lot of people don't realize that Dr. King actually was the author for books. I have no idea how he found the time. He had Strength to Love, Strive Toward Freedom, While We Can't Wait, which includes the letter from Birmingham jail. And the last book, of course, is Where Do We Go From Here, Community of Chaos. And when I look at Dr. King's life, I see a young man starting at 25, 26 years old, sort of, he was sort of thrown into a mix, a cauldron, in which he admitted in his last book, written in 1967, that in 1955, he said, we didn't know always what we were doing. We were making this up as we went along. There was no rule book, there was no guidebook on what the best way, which was the best route to take. Probably they hadn't really thought out what the objectives were. I think essentially the objectives were having equal access to restaurants and the buses and whatnot. I don't think they had thought it all the way through. I don't think most of us think through. I think sometimes as we evolve our vision, our strategies, and our objectives evolve with it. And so I think that if you would read probably Cone's book, Malcolm and Martin, A Dream or Nightmare, I think he comes to the conclusion that the Dr. King of 1967 and 8 was significantly different from the Dr. King of 1955. Because you're talking about a 25 or 26-year-old man. And then now you're talking about a 39 going on 40-year-old man whose thinking has evolved in a lot of areas. There were a number of things that he previously thought, and just like any other wise man, when you come to have a better understanding, then you change your mind. So he says that by the time of his death, that Dr. King was, he had some very stinging indictments against the United States of America, probably as stinging as were Malcolm X's. I think that protesting, we normally equate protesting for black rights with Dr. King, but the reality is that, protesting against racism and white supremacy and injustice is as old as human beings are. Certainly, in terms of black folk, it's as old as slavery. When the first slave protested and cried out to God for liberation from their slave masters. But I think normally when we're talking about Dr. King, we have to consider how people use what I call rhetorical warfare. I personally think that nonviolence as a principle is irresponsible. I think that the context in which Dr. King used it, I think, was sort of an extension of what Booker T. Washington, the great founder of Tuskegee, had spoke about in the speech called The Great Compromise in 1895 at the World's Fair in Atlanta, Georgia, where he was appealing to whites to help him build his institution and to help black people sort of build themselves up through vocational skills. And I think that he understood that even the more liberal whites, liberal being a liberal term, being a relative term, would have been offended at the notion of blacks wanting equal rights, and even more offended and put off if blacks suggested that their humanity required that they use force to defend themselves. And so I think when Dr. King talked about that, and everybody invokes the name Mahatma Gandhi, but people need to remember Mahatma Gandhi, while preaching nonviolence, recognized that there are instances in where force is required to accomplish certain objectives, certainly self-defense. And of course, interestingly enough, like Dr. King, he was murdered violently. So I think the way that the both men were killed tells you that nonviolence doesn't work. It sounds cute and it sounds pretty, and what it does politically, I think it perhaps charms enough people so that they're not threatened by you. I think the language of nonviolence is non-threatening to people, and it makes them more amenable to your cause. But ultimately, our Creator has not only given us a right to, but required, there's a requirement that we use necessary force to repel a violent enemy. And so to that extent, I would have to disagree with Dr. King rhetorically. I happen to think he probably would too. I think we need to do all that we can to be nonviolent in everything that we do. But as with the United States government, as with any military, as with the police, as with anybody, even the law said we have a right to self-defense. So it would appear, based on the way it's been used over the years, I think, as rhetorical warfare to disarm the army. Whenever you hear nonviolence, it's always about black folk. You never hear an American president say we need to be nonviolent. You never hear the police department, which is probably who regularly uses force. You never hear them talk about nonviolence. It's only used when black folk are disgusted or fed up with mistreatment. Then they say, but you got to be nonviolent. So I would disagree with him, but I have the advantage of hindsight, and I have the advantage that people like him put me in a position to share my views today.
We are not your grandmothers and grandfathers in NAACP, and I know some chapters that's what I think of. We wanted to make this organization that already existed, that had a name, to see if we could make it work more effectively for justice in our community.